Technology revolutionizes the way we live, but insecure, negligent, or exploitative technological advancements are threatening global security and stability as we speak. I'm Megan Stiefel, the Chief Strategy Officer at the Institute for Security and Technology. We're a 501c3 critical action think tank that unites tech and policy leaders to create solutions to these emerging security challenges. Welcome to TechnologIST Talks.
I'm Steve Kelly, Chief Trust Officer at IST. We will sit down with entrepreneurs, venture capitalists, and policymakers to learn about the real-world challenges they face in accelerating innovation across biotech, quantum, energy, and other critical technology areas. We'll get their takes on the policies that help or hinder their progress and discuss where they see things heading.
So if you're interested in how technology, policy, and security come together, you're in the right place.
Welcome back to TechnologIST Talks. I'm Steve Kelly, your host for today. I'm excited to be joined by Dr. Alain Harrus, an expert in helping scientists who are driving innovation in technologies like materials science, engineering, semiconductors, and energy to break through. Currently, he serves as operating partner with the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative, where he focuses on emission reduction and climate investment. We discuss how he got involved in the commercialization of science, tracing it back to his time at Bell Labs in the Roaring 80s.
So I was involved in building equipment. I was involved in building factories, semiconductor manufacturing plants. And I really got the epiphany, if you will, that innovation and technology is incredibly valuable once you are able to commercialize it, put it in practice, essentially. Otherwise, it's science for the sake of science. That's wonderful. But I think there was a lot more gratification in the ability of putting this technology innovation into a commercial purpose.
We talk about the unique attributes of the American innovation ecosystem that position our entrepreneurs for success.
You know, there is something very special about Silicon Valley that has transpired to other places in the United States. It's the knowledge on how to build and nurture small companies. And it's not just a question of access to capital. It's the ecosystem, of course, the people to work at these companies, but there are also the legal support, the financial support, and then the community. You know, this is why incubators in the United States have flourished.
And we unpack the differences between venture capital in the United States and China.
What has happened in the last 3-4 years is that venture capital is considered China's government money, and therefore no one should become rich with the government's money. So venture capital, I don't have to explain it. In China, it's becoming more a lending organization rather than a venture investing.
What does Alain's organization do? How does it choose companies to fund? And does he think the U.S. government is helping disruptive tech to scale up? Join me for this and more. I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Alain Harrus. Welcome to Technology Talks.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure seeing you and I look forward to this conversation.
So, Alain, how did you get inspired to get into the sciences?
I've always been interested in sciences, physics specifically, just from being a teenager, growing up, physics, mathematics, and that got me to really follow that track. Education-wise, got a master's degree in University of Paris. Then I moved to the United States, got a PhD in solid-state physics, and that was the beginning of my science career, if you will.
So how did you transition from microelectronics into the energy sector? What was that path?
First, after I graduated, I went to work in the microelectronics, as you mentioned, and that was my first foray, what I would call into research and development, but more development. I joined AT&T Bell Laboratories. I joined Bell Laboratories in the microelectronics, semiconductor manufacturing at a time where AT&T was vertically integrated and we were making everything in order to make our own semiconductor chips. And that also led me to join the semiconductor equipment industry when AT&T started breaking up into the 7 different baby bells. And that brought me to Silicon Valley. And Silicon Valley at that time was all about semiconductor, but was already the transition toward a lot of interest in renewable energy and energy. And the thread and the bottom line common denominator, if you will, is material science. Semiconductor is all about material science. Energy, in many ways, is really about material science as well.
Bell Labs, I noticed looking at your profile in 1984, the roaring 80s, a great time to be in a place like that.
Yeah, so it was an extraordinary place, the roaring 80s and the 90s. So between 84 and 2000, if you will, during this 15 years, this was the growth of the personal computer. The IBM PC was 83 or 84. That's launched the whole wave of desktop computing and a growth of the PC all over the world. So manufacturing of semiconductor just exploded during the 90s. Toward the end of the 90s, we started getting into laptops. And of course, the beginning of the 2000s were more the era of internet and cell phones. So you can track this enormous growth, Moore's law, this enormous growth of computing power toward the different platforms of semiconductor and application. So it was really great years. The transition, as I said, the transition to energy was really the relationship between the materials that people were using. For example, silicon, the whole infrastructure for silicon, for semiconductor, really leveraged out the ability to make solid state photovoltaic cells with polycrystalline silicon or single crystal silicon. So that was very important as well.
Your experience first as a scientist working on materials and working on the solid state technology that went into these products, and then you pivoted into more broadly as an investor, as an advisor to companies. That must have been an interesting journey. How did you kind of leap out of the science into the investment side, the business side?
I can trace that to the following. Number one, brand new, fresh PhD at Bell Labs. It was an extraordinary time. And in some ways, I was lucky enough to be on the development side, not on the research side. I mean, I published papers as a scientist, but on the development side, it's really making things work. So I was involved in building equipment. I was involved in building factories, semiconductor manufacturing plants. And I really got the epiphany, if you will, that innovation and technology is incredibly valuable once you are able to commercialize it, put it in practice, essentially. Otherwise, it's science for the sake of science. That's wonderful. But I think there was a lot more gratification in the ability of putting this technology innovation into a commercial purpose. Okay, so that was at the labs, making chips, then at Novella Systems, selling equipment, building equipment, selling equipment. And this commercialization of technology became one of my really strong passion and interest. And toward the end of the decade, 90s, or around 99, 2000, I decided to leave the semiconductor industry, for no other reason that I was burnt out, actually. I mean, I was a CTO of a really successful company. Company was public. The market was incredible. The growth was fantastic. I was on an airplane all the time. Semiconductor fabs are, at the time, of course, the United States, Europe, South Korea, Taiwan, Japan. So I was just rotating around the world all the time. So I really needed an ability to do some contribution, to do some work where I wouldn't have to travel. As luck would have it, I joined a very early stage venture firm, which introduced me to venture investing. And I spent the next decade, from 2000 to 2013, investing locally, because at that time, venture capital was still somewhat local, mostly Silicon Valley. 30%, 35% of all the investments were in Silicon Valley. So this ability of being local was a key requirement. And at the same time, being able to now, from the point of view of an investor and my experience, help company grow, but with a focus again on commercialization of innovation, using material science at the basis. And that's what led me into first foray investing into energy technologies.
That's a fantastic story. Getting your PhD at Temple University and then moving your way all the way through the business cycle. I'm interested 40 years later or more, I need to do my math here, comparing today the U.S. talent pipeline in emerging technologies and with industrial applications to back in the day when you were getting your doctoral degree and then entering the workforce. How have things changed, and is the U.S. maintaining the pipeline necessary to be competitive into the future?
The short answer is yes. The long answer is it's actually amplified. It's It's never been a better time to be an entrepreneur than being in the US. And over the last 20 years, there's been a very large amount of notoriety about entrepreneurship, about funding, sources of capital, venture capital. Of course, the exits with respect to making a company very, very successful, and the riches of an IPO are somewhat few and far between. But at the same time, there's also a lot of acquisition. So, but entrepreneurs don't do this necessarily for the money. They do this because they see a tremendously difficult problem. They have a scientific solution, and they want to have an impact. So it's really what people sometimes refer as making a dent in the universe. And I forget who created that quote, and the United States is really the perfect receptacle for pouring in of all of these ideas. There's never been a better place for a graduate school in science than the US. And that's amplified over the last 20 years. If you add to that access to markets and access to capital, access to know-how, there is something very special about Silicon Valley that has transpired to other places in the United States. It's the knowledge on how to build and nurture small companies. And it's not just a question of access to capital. It's the ecosystem, of course, the people to work at these companies, but there are also the legal support, the financial support, and then the community. This is why incubators in the United States have flourished. And of course, that model is copied everywhere, all over the world. But there's no question in my mind that the US is as a really preferred premier place for innovation and innovation toward commercialization. So competitiveness derives from that.
Glad to hear that you're bullish on the future, and that the U.S. as a kind of an innovation powerhouse is still we still have the right ingredients to keep that momentum going, which is actually a great time to actually pivot to another country. So we're here also to talk about China, how they're positioned in the innovation ecosystem, what they're doing right, what they're doing wrong, what challenges they're experiencing as well. So talk to me about China, what you know about their evolution as a powerhouse in various deep technology fields, and what do they do to get to this point? And we can talk about kind of what the future looks like, for the PRC.
My experience with working with China, I would say there's one data point and then a long timeline. My first visit to China, to Beijing specifically, was 1996. This was a scientific conference. So I went there, and this was, of course, pre-opening, very different. So it's the traditional image you have of China before the opening to the West. Very few cars, lots of bicycles, one friendship store, one hotel, that was it. Then, of course, China gained access to the World Trade Organization around the 2000 timeframe. And then subsequently, between 2005 and 2019, 14 years, I was in China probably 3 or 4 times a year. So 2005 was when I was as an investor. In 2013, I became the CEO of an equipment company for the manufacturing of display. And most of our customers were in China. So from 2013 to 2019, visiting customers in China also. That's kind of the background for me. And from 2005 to 2019, I had the opportunity to really work with Chinese companies, with customers, with investors in multiple fields: semiconductor, LED for lighting, solar energy, and of course display. So a lot of these fields that rely on material science, both. And I was either investing in a company or working with companies located in China, or having customers and investors from China, right? So, okay. With that said, with this background, what I've watched is, in the beginning, it was an incredible euphoric state between 2000, 2005, 2010. And with the benefit of retrospect, when Premier Xi Jinping became the Premier of China in 2012, there was a continued excitement about this aspect of entrepreneurship and innovation and this creation of companies that peaked right around 2018, 2019. COVID may have had a lot to do with it, but since 2019, I think China has declined tremendously. The metric that I use with respect to number of venture fund created, numbers of companies started, I think it's China is in crisis at the moment. So I've watched this incredible rise, and there was a lot of collaboration, a lot of co-working, a lot of creativity, a lot of entrepreneurs educated in the West going back, Chinese nationals, entrepreneurs educated in the West going back to China, being called back to the mother country to help create companies. And they did. A lot of them did.
So let me just say, there's an interesting Financial Times article that was published mid-September in which a Beijing-based executive is saying that the whole industry has died before our eyes. The entrepreneurial spirit is dead. It's very sad to see. And the article talks about a lot of forces that are coming to play, but talk a little bit about the state of venture capital and the state of innovation in China right now and what government policies might be at play in that trend.
Before I answer that, let me just add something about the fact that, China has a 5-year plan, and they've been operating on a 5-year plan for, the last 60 plus years. And the 5-year plan in this directed economy is a very powerful document that actually serves as a blueprint for investment. So the 5-year plan from the top comes down and then gets distributed toward the different provinces and cities and regions and so on. That has a very powerful guiding impact on how people are spending money and what the incentives are. But what happened as a result of that most recently, as you mentioned, is the fact that more centralized control of the economy. And also, frankly, the entrepreneurs have become too successful. If you look at people like Jack Ma, or essentially a figurehead, incredibly successful because they created tremendously powerful and successful companies. And as a result of that, in a very capitalistic system, benefited from becoming wealthy. And that sense of inequality just didn't sit well with the central party organization. And there's been a lot of effort to kind of bring this down. So what has happened in the last 3-4 years is that venture capital is considered China's government money, and therefore no one should become rich with the government's money. So venture capital, I don't have to explain it. In China, it's becoming more a lending organization rather than a venture investing. And it's very different. I hear that some entrepreneurs are asked to guarantee the venture investment, which essentially has become loans. So it's very difficult. People don't have the means to they don't have houses to sign a collateral loan. And that's what made venture capital so successful in the US, because in the US, for the longest time, no one would lend money to companies. It was too risky and there was no collateral. So if you go back to the banking model of collateralizing an investment, you essentially throttle innovation drastically. And that's what I think where China is at the moment.
Sounds like it's the opposite of VC. And actually, this article also just discusses how oftentimes the investors in startups are actually state limited partners. You've got government jurisdictions that are investing, and they're expecting steady rates of return. That's not venture capital in any definition that the West perceives it. So that's quite interesting. And so, I guess big picture, what's that going to do to their innovation cycle?
I think big picture, it's a crisis. It's a dramatic downturn. It took place very, very, very quickly in the last 3-4 years. I think aside from that, there was COVID on top of that. COVID certainly slowed down the economy. We somewhat recovered incredibly well in the West. I'm talking about your general economy. China still has challenges. Now, they're trying to inject capital into the economy, but the Chinese population is not spending enough. I mean, they rely on the outside of China as a market for the fueling of the economy. So stimulating internal consumption has been incredibly difficult. Trying to turbocharge the economy by the government pumping money essentially into the bank is not going to happen if the bank are trying to play venture capital by lending money as opposed to equity. So no, it's a very, very, very negative scenario. I think that from the competitiveness point of view, China is in a very dark situation, dark place at the moment. And I don't know how long it's going to last. I can't think of how you pull out of it. The investors, let's say, are state employees. The entrepreneurs are asked to provide guarantees on return with preferred rate of return. This is not how you build a company. And entrepreneurs are, I don't know what they do. They probably need to either go outside of China, which is difficult, leave China. So there might be, I think if I were to make some prediction, it's always hard, but I would say there might be a brain drain of people saying if they want to start a company, China is no longer the preferred place to do that. And I've watched it when in 2005, 2010, 2015, where it was an incredible go-go time. You've always successes on both hands, right? But on the whole, it was a very powerful momentum that is completely lost.
Very interesting to see how the next 5 to 10 years plays out there.
Absolutely. And this is maybe where I can separate two segments, right? There is the competitiveness from, let's say, semiconductor, electronics, communication, AI, 5G, 6Gs, and so on. That's one aspect of the West, us being in a much, much stronger competitive position. And that's important for national security. It's important for commercial competitiveness as well. And China is falling behind, period. There's another aspect which you touched on and we should touch on a little more, which is energy and energy transition and the aspect of the work that we need to do to, at some point, transition away from fossil fuels over to new energy generation, right? So essentially, if I use a number, let's say for the US, roughly in the US, electricity comes 30-40% from natural gas. Coal is decreasing maybe 12-15%. And then there's, things like nuclear and so on and so on, right? So how do we move away from natural gas and coal all over the world to things more like long-term nuclear fusion and fission, but also renewable, like wind energy and solar, okay? So that transition, to my mind, is one planet. This is not competitive. We're all in this together, right? So it doesn't matter if we decarbonize completely and China or India continues to build a coal plant every week because the emissions just travel all over the world. But from the competitive point of view, a lot of the innovations are in the West, Europe and the United States, with a tremendous amount of focus on energy investment and energy transition to both ameliorate the climate change that is taking place, but also finite resources with fossil fuel.
That's actually a great point to at this conversation to pivot into what you're doing now. So since early last year, you've been an operating partner at the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative, or OGCI for short. Tell me about OGCI. What is it? Why was it created?
OGCI, the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative, was created as a result in 2016, as a result of the Paris Conference of Parties. And it was the coming together of 11 oil and gas companies putting together an organization including an investment fund. So it was $1.1 billion in 2016 with the purpose of investing in reducing emission and decarbonization. So the fund had a very specific purpose, which was how do we measure carbon dioxide emission, methane emission as 200 times the climate impact than carbon dioxide in terms of absorption of the infrared. How do we reduce emission, measure emission, and how do we decarbonize industry? So that whole segment started with OGCI's 8 years ago. And what's interesting is the following. If we look at timeline, my first foray into what at the time was called clean tech was in the mid 2005. There was a first movement of interest in efficient lighting with LEDs, solar generation, wind, of course, battery energy storage. And it lasted between 2005 and 2012 or so, where after the financial crisis of 2008, funding projects such as those were became out of fashion. And the whole venture industry, the whole investment industry started to focus more on software investing. So during the 2012, 2020, 21, 20 or so for almost a decade, different terms are being used. Deep tech, clean tech, hard tech, doesn't matter. This is really hardware investing became out of favor, all right? In fact, OGCI in 2016 was in the middle of this investment desert, if you will, before it became back into fashion in the last 2 to 3 years. Okay, so investment in decarbonizing industry means a lot of these problems are well known. How do you make cement with reducing carbon emission? How do you make steel? How do you make better energy storage. How do you improve the grid? So a myriad, and the solution is not going to come from one particular solution. It's going to be 1,000 solutions or maybe 10,000 solutions, right? So the first, if I take on solar, for example, the first real application of solar in 2005, 2006, 2007 generated a tremendous amount of interest. Tariffs in Germany, tariffs in Spain, tariffs in Italy that provided a level of support that all of a sudden it became financially viable. One of the key things that people sometimes forget is it doesn't matter how good the solution is. If it's not viable financially, people will not adopt it. At the end of the day, if you want to buy solar panel, it has to be cost effective with respect to the electricity you're buying from, let's say, the grid that is using natural gas, right? But what happened with solar energy is this was a time where China was booming, and China went from 0 to 50 gigawatt of capacity in a couple of years, dropped the prices tremendously, made solar extremely successful, but it killed a lot of company making solar panels in the West. Last year, 2023, it was almost a gigawatt a day was installed in the world. So 360 gigawatt of new solar installation. I would say 98% of the panels came from China. So put that aside. And here we are in 2024. I think there is a recognition that we need to do work on transitioning the energy sources from fossil fuel to renewable energy or other kinds. And a lot of work is going on. The problem hasn't changed. The solutions are somewhat similar. Better materials, better storage, better generation, but we still have to overcome what I would call when you grow technology, you have multiple steps of adoption. So you have the science, of course, and then you have the first prototype. And then when you have the first prototype, then you have to make a product, and people now call that the first of a kind. And they attribute that moniker to, let's say, the first solar factory or the first large-scale energy storage or the first hydrogen manufacturing facility. This first-of-the-kind project requires a fair amount of capital, tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars. But once you've done that and you've proven that you can get on the cost basis competitive in terms of energy production, then after that, it's easier. The nth of a kind or the seventh of a kind, it's cookie cutter, right? So climate investment is part of an ecosystem of climate investors. And fortunately, both in the United States and in Europe, I think there is a solid front of a lot of dedicated investors doing these projects.
Technology maturity. For OGCI, what are you looking for in terms of a technology to invest in? Where is it in its cycle, as you mentioned, and then perhaps the founding team? What are you looking for?
We look at both early stage, so we'll do Series A, Series B. So early stage, beyond the prototype series. So it's both early stage capital, but we also have a fund that provide growth stage capital. So companies that already have some revenues. So energy intensive sector. So that would be energy system, building, transportation, cement, steel. I can pick up a few ideas from our portfolio recently. Vacuum insulated windows. Windows are everywhere, obviously, and we've gone through single pane to double pane. Vacuum insulated windows have always been a challenge to make cost effectively and reliably that the window lasts for 20, 25 years or so. So we made an investment in a company that makes, we think, the best vacuum insulated window. Another recent investment is recycling magnets. Now, it doesn't sound like much, but only 1% to 2% of magnets are recycled. So think about magnets are almost everywhere, from motors to disk drive. Everything that has a little motor has a little magnet. Magnets contain rare earths. Rare earths is a very critical source of rare earths, most of the materials come from China at the moment. So again, this competitive aspect. So recycling magnets is a big deal. You can recover a magnet. We've also made investment in steel, carbon steel. We have a fair amount of investment in methane measurements, from ground-based measurement to drone measurement to airplane-based to satellite. Why is that important? Because you measure methane emission all over the world from facilities that handle natural gas. And if you can't measure it, you can't fix it. So all these leaks and all of these, or either accidental or upgrading equipment becomes really important. So a whole range of what's different about climate investment is we look for financial return. That's very important, but we also look at quantifying greenhouse gases reduction. So all of our portfolio companies and their customers measure how much greenhouse gases reduction on an annual basis, and we publish that. It's audited and so on. So we have two levels of return, reduction of GHG gas and also a financial return.
That's great. Let's move on to talking about governments and their roles in fuel innovation. We've just spent time talking about how private investors, venture capitalists, inject and fuel innovation. But governments also make investments in technologies with national security implications or otherwise advance some sort of a public policy aim. And so the U.S. government, as we know from massive appropriations into climate issues, into modernizing the power grid. And so interested as to whether you've had interactions with U.S. government programs for some of the areas that you've worked over your career and more recently at OGCI. And what are some of the notable programs that you think are actually working? And how is the U.S. government as kind of as a partner in fueling innovation in clean energy?
I did have a multiplicity of touch points with the U.S. government. I mean, one thing that I didn't mention is during the pandemic for almost 3 years, I worked with DARPA as a commercialization advisor, helping both the DARPA team and the DARPA performers think about commercialization of technology.
So that's the Defense Advanced Research Projects Administration.
And, I also spent some time with a fellowship organization called Activate that receives a fair amount of funding from NSF and DOE and DARPA. So, if I were to kind of bucket, there's two main buckets for government capital, if you will. One is innovation, very, very early stage. A lot of money is incredibly powerful as leverage to go, through the NSF, through DARPA, to foster innovation in university at the research level. These are essentially grants. Okay, this is our investment in our innovation infrastructure. When it comes to energy specifically, the government does not make equity investment. They can't fund companies. But what they do is they provide loan guarantees. And loan guarantees really become important because when you are in need of, let's say, and I have some experience that with some of the portfolio companies that I've worked with. I'll give you an example, which is a large-scale energy storage or geothermal energy production. Geothermal is a good example. We are the number one, United States, we are the number one producer of oil in the world. So we have a lot of wells everywhere. And some of these wells are actually pretty deep. And there are some ideas of reusing these drillings once the oil is exhausted there to actually do geothermal. So you inject water, it's deep enough, it heats up because it's hot, and it comes back up. And now you have hot water that you can turn into steam and generate electricity. Okay. You still need to build the first of a kind. And for this project, equity investment becomes really expensive. So this is where you would like to be able to borrow money, but the banks find it too risky. And that's where the government comes in. So these loan guarantees from the government is saying, okay, the bank can loan the money to the company and the United States government will backstop those loans if this don't work out. This program was actually really successful 20 years ago in 2005, 2007. As a whole, there were some companies that didn't make it and lost the money, but as a whole, the program was incredibly successful. And that's a very powerful way for the government to be able to, U.S. government to do that. It's very different than what China does because that's not the same system. But so capital for innovation at the very early stage. Then there is the role of venture capital kind of in the middle, but companies that then need a fair amount of capital for large-scale facilities benefit from loan guarantees. And that is really powerful.
So that's where you see government programs as being particularly useful. And is there enough attention in that area, or is it kind of spotty? There's examples where this has worked well.
Too early to tell because the investment capital only came in. It was passed into law about 2 years ago. The CHIPS Act and the IRA was about 2 years ago. So now we're starting to see the capital being deployed. So it took 2 years. Now, this is the nature of our system. It takes a long time. That's maybe something, I don't want to go there. I don't know how to improve it. I don't even know how this works, but I know that it takes a long time. It takes a long time, but it's there. So that aside, it's having an impact because I know if you go back 20 years ago, this loan guarantee program actually worked incredibly well. The fund made a lot of money for the U.S. government, that is, on this loan guarantee. The bank made money, the government made money. So that's a very powerful way of getting big chunks of capital to be able to deploy that into real valuable projects on the energy side. Because at the end of the day, energy requires infrastructure. And that's what's happening here.
Let's look ahead. So what are some of the macro trends or the key factors that you see influencing both U.S. and also Chinese technology competitiveness? What does the future look like, both in terms of how each system is fueling and encouraging the innovation cycle and our relationship together in in both creating the innovation and also manufacturing the products that need to bring these technologies to fruition?
So if we look specifically, COVID was incredibly timely, powerful, of course, tremendous amount of suffering, but it decoupled the Chinese economy from the West economy. And that decoupling made us realize the globalization, interconnectedness, and the supply chains resiliency or lack thereof. People remember cotton swabs, and because we're missing the little plastic sticks that came from a Chinese, manufacturing. Many examples like that. So there's been an effort in the West to reconsider reinventing manufacturing, not just reshoring manufacturing, because that's very hard, but reinventing manufacturing. And that's been going on for the last 3 or 4 years. How do we manufacture things differently without having to ship, our designs over to China or Vietnam? Or we're still doing manufacturing in Vietnam and China. We haven't stopped. That's not an open secret. That's not even an open secret. We still rely on manufacturing out of China and so on. But there's also this very strong consciousness that we need to rethink the manufacturing cycle, right? So reinventing manufacturing is a big deal. From an innovation point of view, I absolutely feel that the West is separating and China is falling behind. It's falling behind from a point of view, let's say, with respect to the competitiveness on the geopolitical aspect, with respect to access to semiconductor and chips, is having fall behind. But also the fact that innovation is going to fall behind in China because of what we just talked about the lack of innovation capital, venture capital, right? So that also is going to impede China's ability to kind of be competitive in many different sectors, not just military sector or communication, but also access to new technologies for, be it rockets, the way SpaceX is doing it, to new generation of small nuclear reactors that, we have underway in a dozen of companies in the West, energy technologies as well. So I can see how, unfortunately, this decoupling is really in our favor in many different ways. There's competitiveness about manufacturing and this realization that we cannot really depend on China completely 100%. And there's value in resilience of its supply chain.
Yeah, so you mentioned resilience in the supply chain to make sure that the goods can get to where they need to be, and things like global pandemics or other disruptions to global shipping don't put the West in a position they can't get what they need. But then there's the other thing we didn't talk about, which might also be a factor that's in the back of people's mind, is by bringing technology and high-tech manufacturing into China, are they putting their intellectual property at risk? And so, how much is that factoring in?
In the 2000, 2005, 2010, that was a massive problem. Not just U.S., but Western companies would come into China and their technology would be, there was such a hunger for manufacturing things that they would literally steal and copy and just do it down the street.
Just make it themselves.
And sell it back to us, right? So that has happened. It got better for a while because there was an emphasis on intellectual property protection. Of all the things that it got better was the following, right? What the impetus was the following. There was a time where people may remember movies on DVDs, okay? Pirating DVDs was a big problem. So, you could buy a $2 DVD in Asia that was a pre-released movie before it came out in the US, right? Because it had to do with people it's a long story, but, DVDs were sent out in advance to the Academy members to vote, blah, blah, blah. So they got copied. But the reason that got clamped down, aside from the technology moving over to streaming, is that the Chinese movie industry was pirated as well. And they were complaining. So the government said, okay, we need to protect DVD. So it's really interesting. So it was in their it became in their interest to protect intellectual property. So that became a lot less of a problem. And then we had this decoupling with COVID. So, and on top of all that, because of the geopolitical, I'll give you one very specific example without mentioning names, but looking for manufacturing supply chain outsourcing, one of the company I work with specifically is moving everything out of China to either Vietnam or India, finding partners that are more, I would say, along the same lines of thinking and political than China. So that is also this aspect of recreating supply chains that are more resilient, not because they're in the US or in Mexico or in Canada, in the North American continent, but because they are with partners that we feel a much longer term alignment.
So let's end on this. So ending where we began in terms of your outlook, are you bullish or bearish on the U.S. outlook for innovation and global competitiveness in these high technology areas?
Very, very, very strongly bullish, very strongly bullish. We have, by many characterization, we have the best system for innovation and nurturing of innovation. We have the best system for funding early stage companies to kind of try attempting to get this innovation from the scientific side to the engineering side to the product side. We have big markets in the US and in Europe. We have somewhat well-meant government support. So we can navigate through all that to get to a point where generically most of the solutions will be cost effective, of cost advantages compared to the existing way of doing that. So incredibly bullish, yes.
Dr. Alain Harrus, thank you for joining us today at TechnologIST Talks.
Steve, it was a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you so much.